From the Institute for Research on Public Policy, this is Future-Proofing Canada. I'm your host, Jennifer Ditchburn, President and CEO of the IRPP. I want to thank BMO Financial Group for its generous support of this podcast as its presenting sponsor. In early September, the IRPP hosted a one-day conference and launched a major report on the subject of industrial policy. What exactly is industrial policy? Well, let me share the definition that we have in our report. It's governments consciously steering at least a portion of economic activity toward a particular objective deemed to be in the public interest. Needless to say, with Donald Trump's constant drip of tariffs on Canada and Canadian goods and other economic headwinds that we're facing, industrial policy has suddenly become a very hot topic. Today's podcast is a recording of a conversation I moderated at our conference on industrial policy. It was about trade diversification, one of the key responses to pressure that we're feeling from the United States. The panelists were Patricia Goff, professor in the Department of Political Science at Wilfrid Laurier University and at the Balsillie School of International Affairs. Matthew Holmes, Executive Vice President, International and Chief of Public Policy for the Canadian Chamber of Commerce. And Steve Verheul, a member of the Prime Minister's Council on Canada-U.S. Relations and Canada's former chief trade negotiator, among many other senior roles in the Canadian Public Service. Here's our conversation. So thank you to the panel for being here. Last week, when Prime Minister Mark Carney made his announcement on major projects, nation-building projects that are on his list, he referred to what's happening in the global economy as a rupture rather than just a transition. And he talked about the need to transform our economy and diversify our trading partners. Steve, I'm going to start with you. Here we are, many, many months since Trump was inaugurated, and we've started into this new trade reality. Can you give us an idea of the state of play right now in terms of the negotiations?
Sure, happy to do that. I would say that the negotiations at this point between Canada and the U.S. on the new economic and security arrangement are effectively stalled. There are no active negotiations going on. We have the U.S. still not showing a whole lot of movement on key issues like steel, aluminum and autos. And at the same time, the U.S. is also pressing Canada on sensitive issues like dairy, like some cultural issues. So at this point, there's no real acceptable deal in sight for Canada. So negotiations are not moving, discussions are not really happening. Now, I'll just add that the kinds of negotiations that the Trump administration has been entering into, particularly with the EU, Japan, South Korea, various others, are not what we would normally consider real negotiations. There's no underpinning legal commitments. There's a lot of smoke and mirrors around purchase obligations or commitments, investment commitments, which in all likelihood will not be achieved, but are part of the package. But for Canada, I think, at least at this point, is not the worst case scenario for us not to have one of those agreements. And we do have, as the government has said, the CUSMA exemption, which allows most of our trade to continue to go across the border duty-free. But that's not to say that there's a significant amount of trouble lying ahead.
And what happens if we don't come to some sort of resolution on some of the bilateral goods issues before we get into the CUSMA review period that's rapidly approaching?
Well, I think actually Canada would probably be in a better position if all of those issues are still on the table going into the CUSMA review, because I think if the review goes as we expect it should, then it's likely to be a broader range of issues under discussion, which could allow Canada to bring back some leverage. And I think it's more likely to be more technical, more legalistic in terms of trying to make changes to the existing agreement. And all of that puts Canada on stronger ground. It may also possibly be a trilateral discussion as well, which also is an advantage for Canada in my view. So I don't think there's a lot of downsides to dealing with those issues in the review. I think Canada's in a better spot then, but that does mean we're going to be continuing to suffer quite a bit on those areas where we're already facing significant pain: steel, aluminum, autos, where the big tariffs are.
Is there anything that we could be doing to get these negotiations running again?
Well, I think there is an eagerness in some parts of the U.S. to get the negotiations underway. The U.S. Trade Representative's Office has been wanting to get a notice out for consultation over the last month. I'm assuming the White House has prevented them from actually doing that. So I think within the bureaucracy in the U.S., they want to get the review going because it's more solid ground for them too. But the White House is always the wild card in this. And at this stage, we're not even sure whether President Trump is thinking that this would be a trilateral discussion for the review or two bilateral discussions. Still not known. So there's still a lot of uncertainty heading into that review. But I think from a Canadian perspective, the sooner we can get into it, the better.
Thank you. Patricia, we seem to be playing by new rules when it comes to trade. What are they? Can we define them? Is there some sort of way of drawing a picture of what we're living through now?
So that's a really interesting question. Of course, the old rules are still operational, right? The WTO is functioning, even if its negotiating or dispute settlement function has been weakened. Preferential trade agreements are still operational, and as Steve just mentioned, it's indeed the rules embodied in CUSMA that are protecting us right now, right? It's the CUSMA-compliant goods that are not facing tariffs going into the United States. So the rules are functioning. But I might put it in this way, Jennifer, the US is playing by a different playbook. Certainly China has been using a different playbook for some time, but now the US is working from a different playbook. And I think we need to be explicit about it. I still, from time to time, hear media commentators who say, trade policy in the United States, it's chaos, it's incoherent, and I'm not so sure that's true. On the one hand, there are lots of people in and around the administration who have written a lot about this economic policy, and we're also starting to discern some patterns as we look at the various framework deals that are being struck between the US, the UK, Indonesia, Japan, et cetera. And I think we need to pay some attention to them. So Steve started to articulate some of the features of these. Obviously, this is partly a story about tariffs. I personally don't see a scenario where there aren't baseline tariffs and higher tariffs in some strategic industries. I don't know where that will settle, but that seems to be true across the board in all the framework deals. But it's not only a story about tariffs. The multilateral piece of the trading system seems to have gone by the wayside, would be a gentle way to put it. Non-discrimination as the principle that underpins the trading system is clearly been abandoned in the US playbook. And the purpose for which trade policy is being mobilized is different. It's much more about a security story and a political story. So I'm sure you can all think of other elements that seem to define this new playbook. I think it's important that we start to articulate it, that, you know, the government negotiators, they know, but I think it's important that the public know, because I think when different policies come out of the government, if it lands on a public that is working from an assumption that the old rules are still driving the car, I think it creates problems. So I think we probably need to talk a little bit more about what this new playbook looks like in the US context.
Very interesting. Matthew, so we're talking about a new playbook. What are the implications for business in Canada of this new normal?
Yeah, I think I'm just enjoying the conversation. I don't think I need to say anything here, but I would say this didn't start in January. It started in 2016, 2017, and it continued through the Biden administration as well. You know, the implications, like, this is not going to go away. And I think rupture is a good word. I think urgency is also a good word we should be having in front of us. I'll tell you what's bad for business. It's losing your number one customer. And so we need to look at this from a risk perspective as well. We have the majority of our trade currently flowing to the U.S., unfettered by tariffs currently, through CUSMA. The review of CUSMA is starting. I hear USTR will probably announce tomorrow. That's what I just got a text before we came up on stage. So
Breaking news.
so we may have a 45-day consultation period opening tomorrow on the U.S. side. The Canadian side's already done theirs. There will be more, I think. Things have changed a bit. But we need that through line. We have 67 cents of every dollar in Canada is based on trade, import-export trade. 77% of that's with the U.S. The U.S. market, 24 cents of every dollar is based on import-export trade. They have an incredibly robust internal economy. They have a value chain and value creation within their country that we simply don't have right now. And so I guess we're going to need that number one customer, but do we have a number two and a number three? And are we taking care of those? And I think we'll probably get into that a bit during the discussion.
We will. Before we talk about diversification, I'd like to hear you all on China, because we're also getting squeezed from China as well. I think Premier Mo is meeting with the Prime Minister today to talk about canola. Any thoughts on resolution there? Well, Steve, I'll start with you, or where that's going.
Well, with respect to China, we're in a tough position because we've got a situation where we have the U.S. on one side, China on the other side. The closer we get to China, the more friction we have with the U.S. and the reverse. So Canada is in a bit of an impossible situation with respect to China because likely the only exit path for getting out of the difficulties we have with the U.S. is for Canada and the U.S. and probably Mexico to align in large part against China and unfair trading practices from China. That seemed to be how we get out of this and back towards a more North American approach. So Canada can't start dropping its tariffs on steel, on aluminum, on electric vehicles against China without starting to jeopardize that move. And even Mexico now is starting to put tariffs up against China in these areas as well. So I think that leaves us in a box that's going to be very difficult to deal with. And I think at the end of the day, Canada will have no choice but to side with the U.S., given the stakes, as opposed to moving closer towards China.
Patricia?
Well, I would just add to that even if we took the U.S. out of the equation, I think China is still an extraordinarily difficult file. For Canada, obviously, from an economic standpoint, China is very appealing, but from a security standpoint, we're more reticent. And the fact that we're increasingly dealing with these two being intertwined, I think makes it an extraordinarily difficult file for us, even if we were not facing what is very heavy pressure from the United States.
Yeah, it's a catch-22, so I won't restate what both of my colleagues here have said. But it's also our number two customer. And so when I spoke about our number one customer, China's our number two customer. So it's a pretty difficult spot. I think we can take a both-and approach. And if you look at U.S. trade volume with China, it's massive and continuing. So even in the midst of the geopolitical positioning of those two major nations, they are still finding a way to trade. So we need to look at, it's incredibly complex. There are no simple answers to this. Commodities, they need a lot of our food. I think that's a strong position for us. Massive cyber surveillance vehicles on wheels made with dirty steel and poor labor conditions might not be what we want.
We're between several rocks and hard places, I think, across the map on trade. So the public dialogue right now in terms of how to deal with what's happening with the Trump administration and their protectionism, it's all around trade diversification. I mean, this is a common policy topic, and Leah set it out very well for us as well, and also to bring down internal barriers to trade in Canada. Matthew, where do you see the growth potential? And I know this is a big topic in your shop for Canada in terms of strengthening certain trade relationships or building new ones.
There's a lot of answers to that question. I think first we should stop exporting our talent and our IP. That would be a good start. And that's, its own conference right there. I think if you look in terms of what markets, let's look at who got invited to the G7. That was a very savvy list of countries that we needed to restart relationships with, or that have massive growth potential, and also already represent some of our major trading partners. So from a market perspective, I think looking at the kind of BRICS minus the Russia and China piece, and who else was invited to G7, it's an important start. In terms of sectors, and I heard the previous panel talk about defense. I think in the initial phase here, we're going to be a net spender, not a net builder. We just don't have much industrial base here. There's probably some areas in drones, aerial and nautical drones that we could work on. We have tremendous potential in AI, in quantum down the road, but we've also seen this one before where Canada innovates and then somebody else brings it to market. So we have to be careful there. What I would say is I circled the G7 invite list. I'd circle the major projects that were announced just over a week ago as well. When I look at that, I see oil and gas, I see critical minerals, and I see rails and ports. We need our trade infrastructure to be able to get to tidewater, to go east and west and north instead of always south. And we need to really leverage some of the things we have. Critical minerals is one of them. Everybody, whether you're talking net zero or you're talking defense, we need the critical minerals. And then finally, I just underscore energy and agri-food in particular. We have incredible capacity. Those two sectors are the only two in Canada that actually export more than they import. And so the world needs those from us. We can do more to develop more value chain within that space. We have some tremendous innovators within the agri-food space. We can do more there. So let's use the tools we have. Let's use where we're already strong. But there's a lot of innovation that can come from Canada as well.
Thank you. Patricia, can you talk a little bit more about defense and the nexus between trade and defense as an area of possibility?
Sure. I'll full public disclosure, that's not my main area, but I would just say a couple of things that builds maybe on what Matthew has said and what Christopher Reagan said on the prior panel. So this government has been very smart in making sure that a huge increase in defense spending will also ideally have residual gains for industrial development. So that's a smart strategy. But as probably many people in the room know, and there's been a lot of work done on this recently, Conference Board has done some work, McDonald Laurier has done some work, others, that it's how you spend it. Right? So defense spending on its own is not intrinsically stimulative. R&D spending is. Domestic procurement is. And so as this policy gets rolled out, I think I would be looking for those things. To what degree is the money being spent in certain ways such that it does have this stimulative effect?
Thank you. So Steve, are there some complicating factors when we talk about trade diversification in terms of the business community and how it can respond? So it seems to me it's quite easy to say we need to have more partners and build up sectors, but it's probably not as easy as that, right?
Well, no, it certainly isn't, and I think we have significant challenges on that front, in part because Canada has spent so many decades integrating with the U.S. economy. So there's not a process whereby we could break all of those linkages and start to establish them with other countries. We're integrated with the U.S. We provide inputs to the U.S. Much of what Canada produces relies on inputs to be further processed in Canada, and the same way back and forth. So all of these supply chain integrations are not something that can be kind of torn apart and reassembled very easily. In addition to that, we produce to U.S. standards by and large. We produce to U.S. expectations, preferences, what they're looking for. So everything, our 75% of exports that go to the U.S., all geared exclusively to the U.S. So getting out of that is very difficult. And I think when it comes down to it, it's not even a matter of trying to change where your exports are going from one market to another, but you have to change the economy as well, because you're not focused on producing inputs that are going to be used for something produced in the U.S. So a lot of work on that front. And then if you look at other markets that you're wanting to get into, then you have to look at different standards and make adjustments to tailor your products to those markets, which is no easy task. And then even on the easier side of things with finished products, if you're getting into a market like Europe, then essentially you have to displace somebody that's already there, because it's not a new or growing market. It's a very stable, secure market. So you're trying to displace others. Now, I think we have advantages. Energy products, critical minerals, as Matthew was saying, are ways we can get into those markets, and agriculture and some others as well. But not an easy thing to do, not anything that's going to happen overnight, and we shouldn't assume that we can entirely separate ourselves from the U.S. market.
Yes, go ahead.
Just a quick build on that. The Canadian Chamber has a group called the Business Data Lab with a number of economists on team that put out regular reports. And I think next Tuesday we're releasing our Business Insights quarterly. And we've been tracking about 10,000 businesses and their sentiment, how they're feeling across a variety of issues for quite some time, working with Statistics Canada. And what's really fascinating is over the last few months, in response to the tariff and trade environment, about 37% of goods exporters have started sourcing from outside the U.S. But only 27% have started selling more outside the U.S. So that tells me a couple of interesting things. One, businesses in Canada are still fairly resilient and still willing to take the risk of that entry to the U.S. marketplace, but they're looking at them as a very unreliable partner now, and they're not willing to risk their value chain, the manufacturing or the creation of their product, and so they're starting to look for alternatives. And maybe tariffs are starting to push the prices up in the U.S. too, and they can get them for better elsewhere. So there's an interesting dynamic. It's not a linear or logical one, but to your point about that sort of decoupling, it's going to be difficult, and it's going to have multiple ramifications.
Yeah, and I just add to that too, that in talking to some Canadian businesses, one of the dilemmas they have is they're oriented towards the U.S. market. If they're going to get into Europe or Asia, they're going to have to do a fair amount of retooling, a fair amount of investment. But many of them are thinking, is the U.S. going to be like this indefinitely? Are we in for this for the short term? Do we want to spend a lot of money to make conversions to go into other markets, or do we want to just wait this out and assume that the U.S. is going to return to the kind of market in some ways that it used to be? So that's the dilemma that many businesses have right now too. Do you make that decision? Do you do it wholesale? Do you do it partly?
Mm-hmm. Do you think, Steve, that we're focused too much on diversification as a public conversation?
Well, I think we have to pursue diversification just to ensure that Canada can be less vulnerable to the U.S. than we have been of late. So I think it's definitely a worthy goal, but I think we need to keep it in the right context. Not going to solve anything short term, not going to completely displace the U.S. market, and it's going to be a difficult challenge to really get a significant proportion of our exports going elsewhere.
Patricia, is this a short-term thing, or is this what the picture is going to look like? I know I'm asking you to look into a magic 8 ball.
I wish I had a crystal ball. Personally, I think it's going to be a long-term thing. I think that we spend an awful lot of time looking at the person of Donald Trump and not looking at the more fundamental changes that are happening in the U.S. economy and in successive U.S. administrations in terms of their economic policy. So I think it's going to be a long-term thing. Can I say one thing about diversification? I do think language matters. I think it's important to ask ourselves whether diversification is the lens through which we want to have this conversation. Already we've complicated it in really important ways. It's diversification of trading partners, diversification of product mix, and diversification of supply chains. But even there are arguably some limitations in what we're thinking about. And so it's interesting to ask what are the other terms that we can use to capture the thing that we're trying to achieve.
So this is an industrial policy conference, so I'm going to ask some industrial policy type questions. Patricia, the PM made his announcement last week about the first 5 major projects. We can have another debate about whether they were already well towards the finish line or not, and others that are on the list. How is that going to play into the idea of diversifying trade? Is there a direct linkage between the moves that they're making on infrastructure and so on, and a more diverse trade picture?
Yeah, I would say there is and there isn't. If we think of the 5 projects, Kitimat, Port of Montreal, small modular reactors, and then 2 copper mines, copper producing concerns. Kitimat is obviously about diversifying partners. That's its explicit purpose. So much of our LNG goes to the U.S. It's an explicit effort to get more of our LNG going elsewhere. Pure diversification. Port of Montreal, I suppose, is also about diversification, getting that trade infrastructure so that more products can go elsewhere. We saw that on Noah Smith's map today, where he's encouraging us to go east. So there is some potential there for that to create conditions for diversification, but as Steve said, diversification happens as a result of several steps, and so certainly the port infrastructure is perhaps necessary but not sufficient. The copper and the small modular reactors, I think, are sort of interesting. Copper is maybe ramping up something that we already do, and there's high demand for it. I don't think it's not checking the diversification box in any sort of significant way for me. The SMRs might. The SMRs are partly about clean energy, and they're partly about maybe Canada having a niche in this technology. So if it's the latter, then maybe we are starting to check a diversification box that in terms of the product mix, the stuff that we present to the world for sale. So yes and no, it's baby steps. Some yes, some no, I would say.
And can I say on the SMR piece, it's also the IP and the know-how that, not only for our northern and remote communities, but for around the world, it could be a game changer.
Thank you. And I'm going to take questions from the room in about 5 minutes or so get them ready in your heads. Steve, is there a way that we can design a made in Canada industrial policy that recognizes our own trade profile, which is different than, Noah named, examples, South Korea, China. We have a very different landscape here. Australia has a very robust industrial policy, but very different country. Is there a possibility for something that will help our trade situation?
Well, I think there is, but I think we have to kind of recognize and adapt to how much things have changed over a short period of time. Like when we had the Biden administration, there were a lot of efforts to move in the direction of in industrial policy, whether it was the Chips and Science Act, the Inflation Reduction Act, the Infrastructure and Jobs Act. All of those were real industrial policy, and many of them were also oriented towards climate change. And that, I think, was making some progress. Of course, President Trump has now reversed much of that, and as a result, other countries like China are racing ahead on the agenda that Biden has been promoting. So that's the kind of context we're in, and I think Canada is caught a bit between having to align ourselves with the U.S. and follow the same kind of economic thinking to some degree, while at the same time recognizing that the world more largely is shifting towards issues that address climate change. So from a Canadian perspective, I think there are ways to develop industrial policy. I think we have to focus on key sectors. A lot of that relates to energy, oil, liquid natural gas, various other forms. And critical minerals is going to be particularly important as well. A lot of that industrial policy needs to focus on how we get some of our resources out of the ground and into markets, which we all know is an ongoing challenge. We can also diversify markets with agricultural products and seafood products to some extent, so there are opportunities there. Our aluminum sector is moving increasingly into Europe since they're facing the high tariffs into the U.S. So yes, there is a way to have an industrial policy. I don't think we have any choice if we're going to succeed but to have a vigorous industrial policy, because we're not working in a free market by any stretch anymore. But it's not going to be an easy thing to do.
Matt, I'm going to make you the solutions person in terms of like levers in the government. So we have many bodies, many programs that are designed to help businesses diversify their markets, find new buyers for their products. Can you tell me maybe a few that you think we should beef up, amplify, change, new things? What's on your mind?
So much of it is, I think, just a knowledge translation issue for particularly SMEs. The issue of, do they know what resources they have available to them? If you're looking at new export markets, I mean, that's an investment. It's an investment of time, of money, considerable. Steve laid out a number of the barriers that those businesses face. But Canada also has some great resources. The Trade Commissioner Service, I do a lot of work around the world, and the Trade Commissioner Service is like our secret tool, our secret power that many other foreign governments don't have in the same way that we have people on the ground with direct business connections in every major market, and many that we can do business with and who can make that connection. This wasn't a setup, Leah, but EDC puts out a whole range of products. And I know I was in a meeting with some of your colleagues, and they described how when they put out some new information online, they're happy if they hit like between 10 and 30,000 hits on that particular page. And they were telling me about one in which they'd hit like 1 million within like a matter of a couple of weeks. And that tells you the appetite right now of businesses trying to learn more about tariffs, trying to learn more about market access, and some of the tools that they have at their disposal. At the Canadian Chamber, because of our relationship with the International Chamber of Commerce, we have something called the Carnet, which is like basically a visa for your goods, for your samples, for your equipment, if you're going to another market, that says, we're bringing this home with us. And we're the exclusive provider of that guarantee to Canadian exporters. That allows them to go to market, but also it gives them the ability to do a first sale there. And then lastly, I would say what we don't need is more market access. We've already identified how much and how unrivaled we are in terms of access to world markets. What we need is market execution.
Is there some risk, because we're at a moment of we're going to cut, the public service is going to be cut? I think there's no doubt about that. That some of these things that you just talked about might be reduced or constrained because of the fiscal capacity of the government?
I mean, hard one to predict. I think what I'm seeing right now is a reprioritization within government, and one of the priorities is going to be market diversification. So I think my money would be on seeing a bit of those things amped up rather than cut back.
Yeah, no, I agree with that as well. And I think one of the things that the government is doing, or at least should be doing, is starting to offer help to businesses to change their orientation from their alignment, regulatory alignment and beyond, to the U.S. market and convert that to approaches that they could use to align their regulations to EU markets or Asian markets. And I think that kind of help can help make the transition easier. And I think with respect to targets, when we're talking about industrial policy, I think President Trump has been very clear about the sectors that he wants to bring back into the U.S. economy and have manufacturing take place there. So where he has the high tariffs, the steel, aluminum, autos, pharmaceuticals, various others that are there. So I think one of our bigger challenges is really going to be, what do we do with the manufacturing sector if the U.S. is trying to bring back production solely in the U.S.? And so that, I think, is one of the bigger challenges we need to face.
Thank you. Are there some questions? We have a couple of mics here if there's some people that have questions for our panel. While you're preparing to ask, I'll ask about interprovincial trade barriers. Is that actually going to move the needle very much? I know we focus a lot about it, and my colleague Charles Breton's at our Centre of Excellence on the Canadian Federation is in the middle of a great series of papers on that question. But Matt, maybe
Sure.
you.
We love this one. We were talking about interprovincial trade barriers when I was in diapers. And about this point last year, we had an internal conversation at the Canadian Chamber, and we said, this is the moment. We need to, our philosophy is always, particularly with the trade environment right now, if not now, then when? I mean, we're only a G7 nation because of the accident of the fact that we have 13 small economies all clustered together. But if we can't have them working together, we're not really a G7 nation. We're not a country that other governments and other private capital would want to invest in a very active way. And I've had this discussion with major FDI houses that are like, we're going to go to the US because we don't understand how Quebec and Alberta and do this, and none of it really makes sense to them. So I think we have to do it. What we did was we worked this time really closely with our chambers at the provincial level, who had the direct line of contact with the premiers. And we just had that conversation. And we stepped out of the banging the drum kind of message track and more into enabling those provincial chambers to have, and territorial chambers to have, the information about it. It's not a panacea. It's not an instant solution. It's going to take decades for us to get closer together. So we can't replace the US market or any other market with internal trade, but why wouldn't we? Why wouldn't we have an internal economy and labor mobility and other things like that, which fundamentally will give us a better place to grow from?
Thank you. Jim, the senators kindly ceded the floor to you right now.
Wow. Anyways, thank you, Senator. Thank you, Jen, and the panelists. I want to engage, I'm Jim Stanford, Center for Future Work. I want to engage with a framing that Matthew put out right at the beginning, that Canada depends on trade to 75% of our GDP. The Americans only 24%. How on earth can we stand up to them? And a couple of things. First of all, the 74%, you've added imports and exports as a share of GDP. And in Canada's case, that's a huge amount of cross-border trade that is import content in our exports. If you actually look at the net value added in Canada that's exported, it's about a little over 20%. So first of all, I think it's tricky. I'm a big believer in export industries, but we should remember close to 80% of our GDP is produced and consumed inside Canada and never crosses a national border. And this is important for us, I think, just to firm our backbones a little bit in terms of how we approach Trump. But then the other point is that in aggregate terms, in terms of billions of dollars or jobs, the Americans have as much at stake in their relationship with us as we do with them. And I'll point out, they say that Trump is trying to bring manufacturing jobs back to America. Some of those jobs never were in America in the first place. And by the way, America has lost more manufacturing jobs since Trump started this than Canada has. And they are losing as much in aggregate terms, not proportionate to their economy, obviously, but in aggregate terms as we are. And it seems to me that reinforces Steve's point about the value of waiting and seeing what happens rather than rushing into something quick so that he can pull out his Sharpie and sign something that may or may not stick more than a month or two. But in the meantime, the Americans are going to be suffering from their own self-inflicted wounds. And so my question, to all of you, Steve in particular, how do we leverage the pain that Americans are going to experience or are experiencing in the run-up to the CUSMA review, but also the overall relationship, rather than assuming that we are the junior partner who has much more at stake than they do?
And the midterm elections, I'd add.
Sure.
Sure. Well, yeah, no, I think that's the key to what should be Canada's strategy overall. I think there was an expectation that the U.S. would start to feel the pain of the tariffs quickly. Obviously, that didn't happen, but it's going to be happening more and more as time goes on. And economic indicators in the U.S. are going to be looking worse and worse over time. The longer that happens, the more it happens in terms of the extent, the better off Canada is, because as you say, there's this perception that that Canada suffers from all this, the U.S. not as much, but I think at the end of the day, the U.S. will start to see the effects much more dramatically even than Canada. And then I think we have to keep in mind that when it comes to all these tariffs, which are the main elements of all this, these difficulties we're all facing, Trump is highly passionate about tariffs. But if you look around the rest of the people surrounding Trump and other players within the U.S. political system, nobody else believes in tariffs the way Trump believes in tariffs. So as the impact of those tariffs become increasingly evident, there's going to be a lot more internal dissension. And again, there's just one man that really believes that these tariffs work the way he thinks they do. Virtually nobody else believes that. So time is on our side again. I know it's difficult because there's a lot of suffering going on right now, particularly in those sectors facing the high tariffs, and we have to preserve those industries through government measures as necessary. But waiting game is still where we need to be. And just one more comment, I think, having been closely involved in the first Trump term, wasn't that much different. We let the pain build, we let the pressures build and dragged it out, and we were still trying to fix it in the last year of his term, and that's when it worked. So,
And it drove them crazy.
And it drove them crazy, yes. So I think we need to think about that kind of approach, and we can't do anything rash at this point.
Thank you. Senator.
Thanks very much, Jennifer, and thanks for a great conversation. I want to focus on what we have within our control, and particularly building off of comments I think relate to regulation and procurement. We fail miserably on both of those fronts in Canada. We are one of the most over-regulated countries in the OECD. Our regulations are stagnant. They're not agile. They're not providing the protections, I think, that we expected at one point that they did, because everything around us has changed so much. So there's that. And then in terms of procurement, I'm convinced that how we procure, I don't care if it's municipally, provincially, or federally, the way we manage the risks in procurement creates them even more. And if we could get our head around those two issues and how we run them from a public sector standpoint, we become our own best customer. And that's something the Council of Canadian Innovators said, and I think it's a great line. We should be our first and best customer for Canadian innovators. And that, I built 2 companies before I got this job, and I didn't even try to do business in Canada in both situations. It was just too hard. And I always had to explain elsewhere why I wasn't. I had no Canadian customers. I always asked the question. I had no reference customers from Canada, but it was just easier to explain than it was to try and accomplish getting a customer in Canada. And I think we got to change that. So those 2 issues, I just would love to hear our great panelists focus on: the need for regulatory reform and agility that is current and modern, and the need to have procurement that makes Canadian innovators look at healthcare. Half of our public expenditures are healthcare. But we have no healthcare industry in this country. It's crazy, and if you speak to healthcare innovators, they cannot sell into our healthcare system without a whole lot of trouble. So
Thank you.
leave it there.
That's
Thanks.
a great topic. Patricia or Matthew?
Well, as the shill for business, obviously, thank you, Senator. We agree in the need for regulatory reform and a reduction in red tape in the country. It's beyond unconscionable at this point. The rate of regulatory increase over time, we've just started to chart it out, and I'd encourage you to go to our website and look at the Business Data Lab. The most recent chart is trying to put a price on the cost of regulation for Canadian businesses, and I can't remember the number right now, but it's a big one, and it's going like this. And that's just federally. I mean, if you talk about provincial and municipal and everything else. So look, we want a more competitive Canadian economy. We want to challenge, concentration in big industries. Yeah, well, that starts with startups and scale-ups. And how are our numbers there? They're dismal. And why? Who would want to start a business right now in Canada? Like, it's expensive. There's so many rules that don't make sense, and the different governments aren't talking to each other. And then, yeah, you don't have your buyer here at home. So I get a little nervous around the sort of jingoist elements of Buy Canada. I think we have to be very careful in how we proceed there, because yes, we should have anchor clients from big buyers and big procurers in the government, but we need to be careful that we're not making that an exclusive arrangement where we're only casting around for Canadian opportunities and options, because we're still small, relatively speaking, and we don't have that much diversity. So, a couple quick thoughts.
We have time, and I'm going to let Perry and Tim ask the last two questions, so go ahead.
Great, thanks, Jennifer. First, commend you and your team on this excellent day, really thought-provoking. And I guess what I want to talk to the panel about is something that keeps me awake at night. So I'm here serving Canada's public colleges and institutes across the country. And as we talk about the pivot moment or the hinge moment that our Prime Minister likes to talk about so much, the need to build Canada, to really think very strategically about industrial policy. What I haven't heard as much this morning, and I'm hoping I'm going to hear more about this afternoon, is the strategic workforce policy that goes along with industrial policy. Because if we don't acknowledge some of the other major drivers, like aging demographics, like the hollowing out of rural and remote communities because of lack of opportunity, scaling up the learning opportunities for our Indigenous populations across the country, and I'm really excited that there's a panel this afternoon about that. The fact that we are underinvesting in our public post-secondary system across this country, coupled with major disruption because of immigration and a very politicized immigration conversation. I worry that the industrial policy that we are trying to put in theoretical terms will not be able to realize, because at the end of the day, it relies on people. So I'm curious what the panel has to say about that, and I'm hoping that we'll be able to continue this thread this afternoon, because I think that that is really going to be important to realizing the kind of really ambitious goals that our federal government has set, and the interprovincial collaboration that we're seeing that we haven't really seen to this level before.
Thanks, Patricia. I think, it sticks in my head, but I think the mining industry has a number, like 500,000 mining-associated jobs, vacancies in this country, which I had to look at it like multiple times to see if it wasn't a misprint, but...
And the digital economy as well. Like we can predict, and energy. I mean, we can predict with certainty the numbers we're going to need, and our educational system just can't provide that capacity with the domestic population. But.
Go ahead.
Yeah, I really appreciate this question as somebody who's sitting in a university and thinking about this quite deeply, though late to the game. We probably should have been thinking about it earlier. We're finally coming around to thinking about what training do we need to provide to those people sitting in the rows of our classrooms, given all of these shifts that are happening, whether it's emerging technologies or the shift in the economy as a result of geopolitical changes and so on. So I can tell you that those conversations are starting to go on in earnest, but one of the things that keeps me up is that universities are not nearly prominent enough in this conversation, given the contribution that universities make not only to training the workforce, but to research and innovation. So I'm not sure why that is, why it continues to be an underfunded sector, especially in the province of Ontario, but not only, and why it isn't being pulled into the conversation to a much greater degree. So I'd love to talk to you about that later, so maybe we can get that moving.
Thank you.
I'll just say too, I think it's really important that we take an ecosystem approach to our post-secondary. We have amazing universities, but we also have really amazing public colleges and institutes in CEGEP, and it's the interaction with them in industry that I think is going to be one of the solutions. So thanks a lot.
Thank you very much. Tim?
Yeah, thanks, Jennifer.
One
Tim
of our moderators from this afternoon, right?
Thank you very much. I'll try to keep up with you, Jennifer, for our housing panel. Great job getting to the main issues here. I'm Tim Hudak, Partner Council of Public Affairs, and hats off to Stephen and Blair and the IRPP gang for such a stellar panel here as well. My question was around our regulatory bodies here in Canada and the impact you anticipate, if any, in trade with the Americans. President Trump had supply management, finance, transportation, telecommunications, all on the hit list. Where do you see things going, and do you see some trade-offs? Thanks.
Well, yes, no, certainly there's pressure on issues like dairy and the supply management system. There are pressure on cultural issues, Online Streaming Act, various others. So we're going to be under continuing pressure on some of those areas. But when it comes to regulatory bodies, I think more broadly, we're in a pretty good position. I think the U.S. is getting itself into an increasingly weaker position when it comes to regulatory bodies, and when it comes to how they're positioning themselves to try to move forward on some of these issues. So we always have sensitive issues to deal with in a negotiation. We've had long practice with those. I'm not really all that worried about those. I think the far bigger issues are what are going to be the terms of the agreement between Canada and the U.S. And the homework that we have to do on the Canadian side to get us in a much better place than we are now to deal with not just the U.S. but all these other issues too.
Thank you. Patricia, Matthew, and Steve, thank you for being wonderful panelists. A lot to chew on there.
Thank you for tuning in to Future Proofing Canada. I also want to thank our presenting sponsor, BMO Financial Group, for its generous support of this podcast. Our executive producer is Ricardo Montrose. Our production assistants are Elisa Khoury and Blair Elliott. The show is mixed and edited by Jackie Gallant, who also does our music. If you liked what you heard and you want to find out more about the IRPP, you can head over to irpp.org. And you can subscribe to our newsletters and check out all our latest publications. And if you really, really like what you heard, leave us a review on your podcast app or share your feedback on social media. You can find us on most platforms at IRPP. For the Institute for Research on Public Policy, I'm Jennifer Ditchburn. I'll be back in a couple of weeks with a new episode of Future Proofing Canada.